You're listening to Psych with Mike. And remember, the book, Psych with Mike and Brett, A User's Guide to Being Human, has a ton more information in it that is corollary to the things that we talk about here on Psych with Mike. So pick up a copy and leave us a review on Amazon. That is super helpful. Subscribe to Psych with Mike on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts, and leave us a review on Apple if you would like, and that really helps out the show. And now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome into the Psych with Mike library. My name is Dr. Michael Mahan. I am your host for the show. If I had $1 for every time that someone said to me, what's the difference between talking to a friend and talking to a therapist, I would be living in a house on a beach in Turks and Caicos, which is my favorite place on the entire planet. But what is the difference? Obviously, one of the big differences is that people who do therapy for a living have training and experience in delivering psychotherapy services to individuals. So most of your friends probably haven't gone through some coordinated program of education that has prepared them to be able to listen to your problems and offer you alternative ways of thinking or behaviors that are designed to help you be able to solve or at the very least cope with that problem. That is what people who do psychotherapy for a living have gone through. They've gone through a rigorous, at least master's level program in actually learning those kinds of techniques and various forms of talk psychotherapy delivery, from Gestalt therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy to psychodynamic therapy. There are all kinds of different therapies, EMDR, all kinds of different therapies that people can subscribe to. And we have that training, which is different than your friends. In addition to that, every day that I go do therapy for a living, I am getting tons and tons of experience doing therapy. So I've been doing this now since I was in my early 20s. I'm now 61 years old, and that means that I have a lot of years of experience of doing nothing but sitting in a room with another person, listening to the deepest traumatic events that have ever occurred to them in their lives, being able to hold that information without freaking out myself or freaking them out, and then being able to reply to them in a way that makes them feel heard, understood, and supported. So that experience and training is clearly different than probably talking to one of your friends. Even if they have your best interest at heart, they don't have that experience and that training. Another reason that it's different is objectivity. Probably if you have a friend, you have that friend because you like them and they like you. And so they are invested in making sure that you are happy, at least to some extent. They are invested in that, hopefully, or you probably wouldn't have them as a friend. And so that individual is not objective. When you go to psychotherapy, that individual doesn't live with you. They're not a part of your life. They're not a part of your peer group. They're not a part of your family. So they have the ability to look at the information that you are presenting objectively, with you as the client as the focus, but being able to separate themselves both emotionally and cognitively from the milieu of the entire dynamic that you live in and that you're dealing with. That's a huge thing. Psychotherapists are generally not just trying to make you feel good. They're hopefully trying to help you to be able to emotionally regulate better. Oftentimes, that isn't the same as feeling good. So if the idea is I go to therapy and I feel uncomfortable, therefore it's not working, is exactly wrong. If you go to therapy and you feel uncomfortable, that is at least some indication that the therapy might actually be working. Now, of course, there are certain things that you shouldn't do in therapy, and that's another difference between therapists and friends are boundaries, right? So while I am not necessarily invested in making you feel good, I am also not invested in making you feel bad. So your friends have an agenda. That agenda may include helping make you feel good. Sometimes it may include making you feel bad. A therapist doesn't have that same kind of agenda. They're objective. But their boundaries keep them from crossing the line into things that would be inappropriate. And so boundaries are another thing that separates the experience of talking to a friend from the experience of talking to a therapist. So therapists have clear, defined ethical and legal boundaries that if they cross, you can go to your state organization and report that individual and hopefully get some kind of recompense. Either that person will be sanctioned or they will lose their license, but you have some protection which you don't have if you're just talking to a friend. There are no boundary limitations to what your friend can say or do in the course of hearing your traumatic experience. Then probably the biggest thing that is different between talking to a friend and talking to a therapist is the idea of confidentiality. So a lot of people think that they know what confidentiality is, but if I were to ask you to define confidentiality to me, you would probably say whatever I say in the room stays in the room. And certainly that is, in essence, correct. Whatever you say in therapy should stay in therapy unless there is a valid reason why it can't. And so what are the boundaries of confidentiality in treatment? Those boundaries are, if you were to tell the therapist that you intended to harm a person under the age of 18 or over the age of 65, then there are laws in every state that requires that individual, that therapist, to report that information. And so those are called mandatory reporting laws. And every therapist who has a license in the United States is a mandated reporter, just as your police officers are, just as your teachers are. We are mandated reporters. So if you go to your therapist and tell them that you intend to harm someone under the age of 18 or over the age of 65, then that is a boundary to confidentiality. That would require the individual to report that information. Another boundary to confidentiality is if you were to tell that individual that you were going to harm yourself or another individual. This falls under what's called Tarasoff, which is a famous case in psychotherapy that happened in California a while back. And basically what it set was the principle that there are three questions that have to be answered before a therapist is required to violate confidentiality. And the first one is that you have to have an identified target. So you or someone else, you intend to harm yourself or someone else. Then there has to be a plan. So you intend to harm yourself by shooting yourself with a gun. And then there have to be means. So the therapist, upon hearing that information, should ask you, do you own a gun? Maybe the therapist already has that information and knows that you own a gun. If you don't own a gun, the therapist should follow up and say, do you intend to go buy a gun? Is that something that you're going to do today? Those three questions have to be answered. And if I have answers to all three of those questions, if I know that you have a target, let's say yourself, and I know that you have a plan, like you want to hang yourself, and I know that you went and bought rope on the way to my office, then that is information that becomes emergent, meaning that I now have to report what I know to the appropriate authorities to try and make sure that that doesn't happen, that you don't actually end up harming yourself. So those are the limits to confidentiality. But beyond that, And I would be remiss if I didn't say there's one more limit to confidentiality, and that is if the therapist were to receive an executable subpoena. Now, what is the difference between a subpoena that's executable and one that isn't? Well, a lot of lawyers will send out inquiries for information. So they will send a doctor or a psychotherapist or anyone else a subpoena for information, thinking that most people will get a subpoena and not want to go through the hassle of trying to fight it and will just respond. The truth is that a subpoena is only executable if it's stamped by the court clerk. So subpoenas that are delivered without a stamp of the court clerk is not an executable subpoena. And therefore, my recommendation is that if you are doing psychotherapy for a living, that you understand what are the laws in your state about responding to a subpoena. If you respond to an unexecuted subpoena, then you are actually at risk of violating confidentiality because you don't have the requirement to share that confidential information. Now, there's another way in which you may have to provide information as a therapist to a third party, and that's if there is what's called an ROI, or release of information. So every client has the right to ask for their information to be released. So if the attorney sends you a subpoena with a signed release of information from the client, then that subpoena is executable and you should and must respond to it. But otherwise, we have confidentiality, which means that what we will not do as therapists is that we won't go behind your back and tell your mom and dad what you told us. We won't tell your spouse. We won't tell your other best friends because we have confidentiality with you. And that is a huge difference between what you get when you are talking to a therapist and what you may get when you are talking to a good friend. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Therapy is an important tool to be used to help individuals either regain, establish for the first time, or return to good emotional regulation. Sometimes that is the agenda of your friends and sometimes it isn't. But for a therapist, hopefully that is always the focus. Remember, we have a book out, Psych with Mike and Brett, A User's Guide to Being Human. You can get that on Amazon. Please, please, please support the show by subscribing, and you can do that on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, and if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, that would be fantastic. The music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue, and as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.